Dear Tim and Moby, how come Malcolm X doesn't get a holiday like Martin Luther King? Curious, shy. That's a tough question. Both Malcolm and Martin were hugely influential leaders during the American Civil Rights Movement. They were focused on the same goal of achieving equality for African Americans, but they followed profoundly different approaches in their fight for freedom. King took cues from the Indian struggle to end British colonial rule. Its leader, Mahatma Gandhi, had relied on peaceful means to liberate his people. His methods of nonviolent protest inspired King. Malcolm X took a much more aggressive stance. That's why he's often considered controversial. Malcolm Little was born in Nebraska in 1925. This was during the height of segregation in America. African Americans were kept apart from whites in public spaces like schools and restaurants. They could only live in certain neighborhoods and hold specific types of jobs. Segregation policed black behavior, too. They had to act with the utmost respect toward whites. Failure to do so ran you the risk of being jailed, beaten, even killed. Well, segregation was worse in the South because it was enforced by the state. In other parts of the country, it took a subtler form. Citizens themselves made sure that African Americans were kept down. Growing up in the Midwest, Malcolm felt this firsthand. He excelled in school and dreamt of becoming a lawyer, but a teacher told him to forget about that and become a carpenter instead. At home, Malcolm received a more encouraging message. His father, Earl, spoke out for the rights of African Americans. He organized meetings and urged his community to take a stand against bigotry. That made the Littles targets of violent hate groups. When Malcolm was only 6, his father died under very suspicious circumstances. The death fractured Malcolm's family, and he ended up dropping out of school. He got caught up in a life of crime and wound up in prison. Yeah, but it was there that he began a lifelong journey of self-education. He read constantly, devouring everything from history to science to philosophy, and began studying the teachings of a black Muslim group, the Nation of Islam. Up to that point, he hadn't thought much of religion, but the NOI was like no religion he'd ever heard of. Its ideas seemed to explain the deep anger Malcolm was feeling about where his life had ended up. The NOI said that America would always be a racist country, and that African Americans would never get a fair shake there. The only reasonable response was black nationalism. The desire to carve out a completely distinct country for black people. This might be in the United States, or maybe even in Africa. African Americans would have their own schools, businesses, and government. Many civil rights leaders saw these views as extreme, or even racist. But Malcolm was drawn to the nation's goals. While in prison, he began writing to their leader, Elijah Muhammad. He joined the movement and took the name Malcolm X. This was a common practice among NOI members. Many African Americans had inherited their last names from slave owners. The X was a rejection of that legacy. It also represented a broken link to their African roots. They could never really know their real names or larger family history. Taking pride in their African heritage was a big part of NOI teachings. After his release from prison, Malcolm X became a champion of these ideas. He gave fiery speeches promoting black nationalism. He also criticized mainstream civil rights leaders' message of tolerance and harmony. It made little sense when African Americans were being abused and killed. Eventually, Malcolm X was featured in a news program about the Nation of Islam. He said the NOI didn't want to improve relations between the races, and that whites were corrupt and murderous. The show shocked its national audience. Some saw the anti-white sentiment as its own form of bigotry, but plenty of African Americans felt the NOI was finally giving them a voice. Membership doubled in the weeks following the broadcast. Malcolm X helped take them from a small group to a national movement. He even inspired the world's most famous athlete, boxer Muhammad Ali, to join. But as the media attention grew, so did tension within the NOI. Elijah Muhammad began to see Malcolm's popularity as a threat, and Malcolm began to question NOI leadership. He split from the Nation of Islam in 1964. He converted to the Sunni sect of the religion and set off on a pilgrimage to Mecca. This journey to the birthplace of Islam is a rite of passage for Muslims. In Saudi Arabia, he saw people of all races worshiping together. On a trip to Africa, he saw white students caring for the sick and needy. Malcolm began to see the plight of black Americans from a new perspective. Unfortunately, he would have few chances to share his new outlook. He was assassinated less than a year after his journey to Mecca. It's widely assumed he was murdered by agents of the Nation of Islam, revenge for Malcolm's criticism of Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm's views had softened in the last year of his life, but he never came around to King's focus on peaceful demonstration. He was more in touch with folks' frustrations than their sense of hope. A big part of his appeal was that he provided an outlet for this anger. I'm sure that's partly why there's no national holiday for him, like Martin Luther King Day. Hold on, what are you writing? You can't just use what I said in your Malcom X report. Have you learned nothing from our plagiarism movie?